A black man asked for silence. 10 minutes later, he was handcuffed like a criminal. No threats, no weapon, just a quiet voice in a diner he'd visited every morning for 15 years. What the cops didn't know, the man they dragged out was a decorated Marine sniper who once saved 37 soldiers in Vietnam. So tell me, which state are you watching from? And where you live, is justice still justice when the hero is black and silent? Because this story doesn't start with violence. It starts with dignity and ends with the truth punching back. Let's begin. Morning sunlight poured through the dusty glass windows of the Rose Junction Diner, an old eatery tucked at the corner of Monroe and 5th Street in Elmswood, Georgia. Inside, Jeremiah D. Knox sat quietly in a worn leather booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The wall clock read 7:12 a.m. He'd come here like this every day for the past 15 years. One cup of coffee, one newspaper, one quiet pause from a world that had only grown noisier. Jeremiah, 66 years old, a former Marine Corps marksman, his hair now silver beneath a faded cap embroidered with the words Semper Fi. He had saved dozens of lives in combat, taught U.S. history for 3 decades, but here, he was simply the old regular in the corner booth. On the table lay a folded copy of the Elmswood Gazette. Open to page 3. Next to his cap, and a small purple heart pin fastened to his gray fleece jacket. Every detail spoke of a man seasoned by time, who had lived with purpose. Quietly, a kind of man today's generation hardly seemed to notice, let alone respect. The glass door swung open with a shrill chime. 3 white boys walked in, ripped jeans, designer hoodies, reeking faintly of liquor and weed. Chase Whitmore led the way, sneakers spotless like they'd just come out of the box. A smug grin stretched across his face, eyes full of casual contempt. Behind him, Hunter Blake and Logan Fairchild snickered as they scanned the diner. "Look at this," Chase said loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. Old black guy hogging a whole booth this early. His disdainful glance swept across Jeremiah as if the old man were an obstruction in a world built for their entitlement. Jeremiah didn't respond. He simply folded his paper. "Would you mind keeping it down?" His voice was low, steady, firm. Not angry, not threatening. Just a simple request for the bare minimum of decency in a shared space. "You giving orders now?" Logan sneered, chin jutting forward with mock aggression. "No," Jeremiah replied calmly. "Just hoping folks can enjoy breakfast in peace." There was something in his composure that unsettled Chase. His face flushed, not with shame, but with the simmering heat of being challenged by someone he thought would be easy to dominate. The fragile pride of a boy who had never been told no cracked beneath the weight of a single, quiet sentence. "Call the cops," Chase suddenly shouted. "He threatened us, said he had a weapon. Someone please help." Denise Hampton, the Salvadoran waitress who had served Jeremiah for more than a decade, cried out, "That's not true." He just asked them to lower their voices. Don't call the police. But it was already too late. Chase had dialed 911, his voice trembling with carefully performed panic. "There's a black man here. Looks dangerous. A veteran. Might be armed." Jeremiah glanced out the window, where sunlight still spilled onto the worn brick wall. But he already knew, in 10 minutes, the very country he had served with blood and honor would turn its back on him. No need for evidence. Just one accusation from 3 boys who had never been held accountable for anything in their lives. And in a place once called the land of the free, a man who had sacrificed everything was about to be handcuffed simply for asking others to respect the morning silence. Less than 10 minutes after Chase's call, a patrol car quietly pulled up in front of the diner. 2 white police officers, Cole Rickman and Brooke Hensley, stepped inside, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes scanning the air as if walking into a violent crime scene. The chatter in the diner fell silent. Chase sprang to his feet, pointing toward Jeremiah. "It's him. He threatened us. I think he's armed." Rickman moved swiftly to Jeremiah's table. "Stand up. Hands on the table. Don't move." Jeremiah didn't flinch. His voice was calm and firm. "I'm not armed. I simply asked them to lower their voices on a peaceful morning." Hensley frowned. Are you a veteran? I served in the Marine Corps. My rank and service record are fully documented. You can verify it. But Rickman didn't care for explanations. Being a veteran doesn't put you above the law anymore. Without further questioning, Rickman yanked Jeremiah from his seat and forced his arms behind his back, though Jeremiah didn't resist. A few hushed gasps escaped from other diners, but no one intervened. No one stood up. You're under arrest for making threats and disturbing the peace, Rickman stated coldly. Though no one checked the security footage, no one asked for additional witnesses, and no one searched Jeremiah's belongings beyond a rushed pat-down. As Jeremiah was let out of the diner, hands cupped behind him, his gaze paused at the glass door, where morning sunlight still glinted against the faded old sign, Rose Diner, since 1962. And he knew, it only takes seconds to speak the truth, but some prejudices can imprison a lifetime. When the jail cell door slammed shut behind Jeremiah D. Knox, he didn't feel angry, just a hollow ache, thick as a December fog settling over his mind. In 30 years of teaching history at Eastmont Community College, he taught hundreds of students about constitutional rights, about the principle of innocent until proven guilty. But now, what he saw in the eyes of those around him, from police, the media, even the public, was a verdict already written. Less than 24 hours after the incident at Rose Junction Diner, Jeremiah was officially charged with second-degree terrorist threats and public disorder. The way those phrases echoed across Channel 9 News made it sound like he'd walked in with an assault rifle, not a morning paper, and a courteous voice. On the other side of the courtroom stood District Attorney Clara Voss, 43 years old, sharp-minded, ambitious, and currently running for mayor of Elmswood. Jeremiah knew nothing about her, but she knew plenty about him, or at least the version of him that had been crafted from 3 white boys' lies. For Voss, this wasn't a fair investigation. It was a golden opportunity to prove herself to conservative voters. We will not tolerate anyone threatening your children, even if they're a veteran, a professor, or a so-called hero. Jeremiah's court-appointed defense attorney was Nina Ralston, 28 years old, just 3 years out of law school and looking even younger than her age. She made her first appearance in the interrogation room with tired eyes and a thin case file filled with hastily printed pages from the police report. Mr. Knox, I was only given 40 minutes to review this case, she said in a soft, cautious voice. The prosecution has 3 witnesses. They all claim you made threats using terroristic language. They say you talked about war, about making people disappear. Jeremiah stayed silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because who was there to say it to? What weight did his words carry when boys born into privilege were seen as more credible victims than a man who had spent his life in service? We don't have the budget for an independent investigator, Nina continued. I can't prove they're lying unless someone else steps forward. But the waitress, Denise Hampton, she's an immigrant. They threatened to call IC if she testifies. Jeremiah felt his chest tighten. Denise, the woman who used to secretly slip him extra cookies on cold winter mornings, who called him professor with that gentle Salvadoran accent, was now forced to choose between justice and deportation. So, I'm alone, he murmured. We can negotiate a plea deal to reduce the sentence, Nina said, eyes still on the file. But if you want to fight this all the way, I'll do everything I can, even though I know it won't be enough. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair. The interrogation room was cold, fluorescent lights flickering faintly above. Part of him wanted to scream, to smash the table in front of him and roar that truth should never be buried beneath skin color or political theater. But the larger part, the part that had survived 4 years in Vietnam, understood that silence could be more powerful than anything else. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, Clara Voss was drafting a campaign speech. And he, Jeremiah D. Knox, sat here, awaiting a trial whose verdict he already knew. Still, he would not bow his head, not while the truth still existed. 3 days after his arrest, the mugshot of Jeremiah D. Knox appeared on Channel 9's broadcast just before dinner time, the hour when Elmswood's elderly viewers sat down with their meal trays and open hearts to the evening news. The image showed him in an orange jumpsuit, eyes steady but weary, displayed beside the headline. Dangerous veteran threatens students in diner. There was no mention of the Purple Heart. Not a word about his years as a beloved history professor at Eastmont Community College. And, of course, nothing about the fact that he'd simply been drinking coffee in peace when it all began. The news segments replayed Chase Whitmore's fake 911 call on a loop, dramatic audio of the boys sobbing, saying an old black man might have a gun, talking scary stuff about killing and war. The recording was cut and edited with tense background music, designed to make it sound like an imminent terror threat. He used to be a sniper in the Marine Corps, right? A Channel 9 anchor asked on air. That makes me wonder, are we letting traumatized veterans roam society without any oversight? Beside him sat a so-called community safety expert named Dr. Franklin Laurie, a man who had never met Jeremiah but was more than ready to offer his opinion on camera. We refer to this as trained lethality, Laurie explained. Many veterans, especially those who served in Vietnam, overreact to minor stimuli. They're not criminals, but they are risks. From inside a holding room at Eastwood County Jail, Jeremiah watched the segment on a small wall-mounted TV. Footage of him played on loop, wedged between commercials for frozen dinners and arthritis medication. A group of other inmates nearby snickered when his face came on screen. One of them muttered, half joking, "Looks like this old man's more famous than last night's football game." Jeremiah didn't react, but inside, the pain burrowed deeper in the old wound in his left leg, the one he'd earned while dragging a fellow soldier out of enemy fire near a Vietnam outpost in 1971. Even in the courtroom, his image was distorted. Nina Ralston, his attorney, tried to submit his military honors and clean psychological evaluations as character evidence. But Judge Vernon Beckwith, known for being strict on law, lenient on empathy, took only minutes to dismiss the motion. The defendant's service record has no bearing on the current charges. Beckwith declared, "This court does not judge character. It judges conduct. But, Your Honor, the prosecution is using that same military past to argue that my client is a threat." Nina pushed back. "I've made my position clear." The judge snapped. Further argument will be considered contempt. One by one, every path to vindication was blocked. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the evening program Community Talk aired an interview with Chase Whitmore's mother. She wore a floral dress, her voice trembling. "We don't hate anyone, but as a mother, I'm terrified at the thought of my son being harmed by someone trained to kill." Applause followed. The host nodded solemnly. The narrative was set. Jeremiah was no longer a man. He was a symbol of fear, of violence, of a country that had never known how to treat those who bled for it. Jeremiah returned to his dark cell, where the fluorescent lights never turned off. He rested his head on the thin mattress, his hand placed over the spot on his chest where the Purple Heart used to be pinned. Now just a memory the court refused to acknowledge. He whispered a line he'd often repeated in class. History isn't only what's written down, it's also what gets forgotten. And he knew then he was being turned into a rewritten chapter of history, distorted on the very soil he had once risked his life to protect. The light inside courtroom 3 of the Elmswood County Supreme Court that day didn't come from bulbs. It came from dozens of TV cameras, focused on a moment waiting to be sealed by verdict. No one spoke as a jury filed in. 12 faces, 10 white, 1 Latino, 1 black, taking their seats in an air thick with bias and pretense. Judge Vernon Beckwith, his slick-back silver hair and voice like a wartime newsreel, spoke. "Mr. Thomas Ellery, foreman of the jury, have you reached a final verdict?" A man in light gray tweed and glasses stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of second-degree terroristic threatening, how do you find the defendant Jeremiah D. Knox?" "Guilty." A sharp breath came from the back row, where Alyssa Knox, his daughter, clenched her fists against her knees to keep herself from standing up. "And on the charge of public disorderly conduct." "Guilty." Jeremiah didn't move. His face remained stone-like, but his eyes, those same eyes that once scanned jungles through the scope of a rifle in Vietnam, now gazed across a different battlefield. Quiet, calculated, and far more insidious. Judge Beckwith slammed the gavel down. "The court will reconvene for sentencing in 7 days. pending victim impact statements and final reports. He turned to Jeremiah. Given the gravity of the offenses and the risk of reoffense, I hereby order the immediate detention of the defendant. Goodbye, Mr. Knox. Outside the courthouse, the October wind cut across the skin like sandpaper, but the sharpest sting wasn't from the air. While reporters mob-chased Whitmore's mother for interviews, Alyssa stepped into the chaos of cameras with fire in her eyes. A Channel 9 journalist shoved a mic toward her. "Ma'am, your thoughts on today's verdict?" "My grandfather once said they can take your name in 30 seconds if they don't need proof. Today just proved he was right." That evening, Alyssa received an email from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where she had served as head nurse for 9 years. Due to prolonged unexcused absence, your contract is hereby terminated effective immediately. A few days later, her 13-year-old son, Jaden Henderson, had his notebook torn to shreds by classmates on the schoolyard. They threw it into a toilet while shouting, "Your terrorist grandpa doesn't belong. Why do you even go here?" But the cruelest blow came the following Sunday morning, when Alyssa brought Jaden to Cornerstone Baptist Church, where Jeremiah had once led Bible study for years. Pastor Lyle, the same man who had prayed over her mother's casket, met them quietly in the foyer and whispered, "Miss Alyssa, maybe it's best to wait until things settle down. Some of the congregation are feeling uncomfortable." Uncomfortable? Around who? A lifelong veteran who'd done nothing wrong except live too quietly in a world that never stopped shouting? That night, while sorting through job applications in her small apartment, Alyssa heard a knock. A package lay at the door, unmarked, anonymous. Inside was a single USB drive. No note. She hesitated, then plugged it into her laptop. The screen lit up with one line. Security footage, Rose Junction Diner, 7:10 a.m. Alyssa froze. The screen showed the 3 boys entering, drunk, loud, laughing, and Jeremiah, sitting still, hands resting calmly on the table, shaking his head slightly and saying something inaudible to the camera. 1 minute later, Chase pulled out his phone and began performing. Alyssa covered her mouth with her hand. A truth had been buried, and someone from the shadows had just handed her a chance to reclaim her father's life. For the first time in weeks of hell, Alyssa felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't hope. It was fight. This battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jeremiah D. Knox was transferred to Clear Haven Correctional Facility on a cold morning in mid-November. The iron gate screeched open like it resented swallowing a man who had once fought to protect this nation's freedom. The morning sun reached only as far as the barbed wire fence, unable to pierce the chill that gripped his 66-year-old body. A veteran, and now an inmate identified as number 74986. Stand up straight, eyes forward. Wipe that look off your face, old man. A corrections officer snapped as Jeremiah passed through processing. Jeremiah didn't resist. He didn't bow. He followed each command, each movement, precisely as he once had as a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps during his tours in Southeast Asia. Even as his personal belongings were stripped away, his wedding ring from Lillian tossed into a metal tray without a word, he remained composed. His cell was in Block D, 3rd floor, shared with a bunkmate named Ramon Deuce Holloway, 59, a repeat offender with record of armed robbery. When Deuce first saw Jeremiah, he tried to assert dominance, just like he had with weaker inmates before. But Jeremiah's quiet presence shut all that down before it started. "You a soldier or something?" Deuce asked. "4 tours in Vietnam," Jeremiah replied, then sat on the metal bed and began folding his sheets with such precise technique the military itself would have nodded in approval. 3 weeks later, Jeremiah had become something no one expected, a silent teacher behind bars. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday afternoon, he taught reading and writing to inmates who'd never earned a high school diploma. His voice was steady, measured, like a cadence drill during boot camp. No fancy words, no preaching. He taught about the Constitution, about Lincoln, about Brown versus Board of Education. Men who once thought learning was a waste of time now sat with notebooks borrowed from the prison library, taking notes like their lives depended on it. "That old man really knows what he's talking about," one inmate whispered. He's not teaching to show off. He teaches because he actually thinks we still matter. The letters started coming, in stacks, from Ohio, Texas, Alaska, from people with names like Corporal James Finley, Bravo Company, or Martha Jean Delaney, widow of a veteran. Every letter said the same thing. They'd read his story in a viral article online, and they believed in him. One letter from Montana read, "Mr. Knox, I was a paratrooper in Desert Storm. I know what it feels like to be treated like a shadow, but you're no shadow. You're the flame reminding us that honor isn't defined by the sentence someone else puts on your name." Jeremiah read each letter. He didn't cry, but his hands trembled slightly as he folded them and placed them into a cardboard box under his bed. The people who wrote to him didn't know him, but they recognized him, not through a mugshot, but through the dignity that radiated from his silence. Outside, Alyssa Knox wasn't sitting still. Using the footage from the anonymous USB, she accessed the forum of the National Veterans Association and posted her father's story, along with 2 photos, one of him in uniform during his youth and one of him now. The post spread like wildfire. 3 days later, a message arrived in her inbox. The sender, Troy Keenan, an appellate attorney, former Marine Corps lieutenant, specializing in wrongful convictions of veterans. The message was simple. "I read about Mr. Knox. He shouldn't be in there. I want to help. Meet me in Atlanta, Thursday, 8:30 a.m. Alyssa stared at the screen, heart pounding, not because hope had arrived, but because, finally, someone was listening. Jeremiah knew nothing of that meeting. But that night, in D Block, as he opened another letter from a soldier named Elijah, he simply exhaled and smiled. Something in the air had shifted. Not freedom, but a new wind was beginning to blow. At 11 a.m. on the 3rd floor editorial room of the Elmswood Tribune, investigative reporter Jessa Vaughn sat in front of 2 glowing monitors, headphones on, fingers racing across the keyboard. On screen was the leaked security footage from Rose Junction Diner, the initial evidence provided by Alyssa Knox. But Jessa didn't stop there. She'd been in journalism for nearly 15 years, digging into school budget scandals and dirty campaign tricks. But the case of Jeremiah D. Knox, it struck a different nerve. A father, a veteran, a living symbol trampled by power and prejudice. And most importantly, it reeked. Jessa started with the name Chase Whitmore, the primary victim in the case, son of Wendell Whitmore, a longtime campaign donor for DA Clara Voss. In a 2020 interview, Wendell once stood beside Clara and declared, "Our family believes Elmswood needs a firm hand to protect the next generation from unpredictable dangers." The danger he referred to turned out to be a retired history professor sipping morning coffee. Jessa dug deeper. In the Elmswood County Court archives, she discovered that Chase had been arrested for marijuana possession in Athens in 2021. The file disappeared from the system within a week. A source inside the clerk's office confirmed that Chase's father had spoken privately with the local judge. Hunter Blake, the second boy in the group, had been suspended from Georgia State University for cheating on a final exam. He wasn't expelled, but placed on conditional academic leave. Hunter's family ran a high-profile law firm in suburban Atlanta. Logan Fairchild? Worse. Jessa uncovered a sealed school violence incident from when Logan was in 11th grade. The victim, a black classmate, had been pushed down a flight of stairs. Logan spent 2 days in juvenile detention, but the case was buried by his parents under the label Internal Educational Matter. 3 young men, 3 dirty stories, and all 3 praised by the media as young victims threatened by an unstable veteran. Jessa knew she had found the core of the story. She called her editor. "Brad, I've got something that's going to blow Elmswood wide open." "What are we talking about?" "A cover-up to bury a man's honor and build a false narrative. And now, I have the name behind it all." 2 days later, the Elmswood Tribune ran a front-page story with a bold headline, "The Truth About the Jeremiah Knox Case. Privileged sons seal records in a filthy political campaign." The article didn't just go viral in Elmswood. It was shared on veteran forums, reposted on civil rights Facebook pages, and hit the front page of the Atlanta Daily within 24 hours. Inside his cell at Clearhaven, Jeremiah received a printed copy of the article. A guard had left it silently on his cot. On the front page was a photo of him teaching in prison, beside a headline that read, "The man branded a threat." Turns out to be the one teaching society how to face the truth. In Chicago, Alyssa stood on the Amtrak train platform, holding a file folder of jury findings just sent over by attorney Troy Keenan. Behind her, the crowd moved in waves. In front of her, the train that would take her back to Elmswood. An elderly white woman passing by glanced at the folder in her hand and whispered like a prayer, "May God grant your father justice. Men like him should never be left behind." Alyssa gripped the folder tighter. Her eyes no longer welled with tears like in the early days. Now, they gleamed like polished steel. The game had changed, and this time, the truth was the one pressing charges. At 6:43 a.m., a UH-60 Black Hawk military helicopter descended onto the helipad just north of the Elmswood County Courthouse. The rotor's wind whipped to the flags in front of the building, sending security personnel scrambling to hold down everything that wasn't nailed to the ground. The side door swung open, and the first to step out was a man in a sharply pressed uniform adorned with 3 gleaming silver stars. General Conrad Ellison, 71, once a legendary commander in the U.S. Marine Corps, now a living symbol of loyalty and justice. But today, he wasn't here on behalf of the military. He had come as a man who owed his life to Jeremiah D. Knox, who had pulled him out of enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam in 1973. In his hand, he carried a deep brown leather-bound dossier, inside which were declassified Pentagon documents, including combat reports, chain of command records, tactical maps, and most importantly, a formal Medal of Honor recommendation for Corporal Jeremiah D. Knox. A recommendation that had once been ignored, then quietly buried. 3 hours later, in the courthouse press briefing room, reporters packed the hallways wall to wall. Jeremiah Knox's name was now on the lips of an entire state, but no one expected the silence to be broken by a legend. General Ellison stepped up to the podium as if he were entering the final trench of his life's campaign. Flanking him were Major Eli Trask, a military historian, and Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Pike, the Pentagon's legal liaison. "Thank you all for being here." His voice rang out, clear, unwavering. "I stand before you today for one reason only. Justice has been asleep far too long. And Jeremiah D. Knox is the one paying the price for its silence." Then he opened the leather case. The first document held up to cameras was a formally classified report on Operation Ridgeback Echo, detailing how Jeremiah had single-handedly held off an entire North Vietnamese company for 6 hours, allowing the safe extraction of U.S. troops by helicopter. Jeremiah saved 37 lives, Ellison stated solemnly. "One of them was mine. I never forgot, but the system did." Suddenly, a woman's voice echoed from the back of the press room. "And now that system is afraid, because he's about to be honored." Every camera turned. Standing amidst the crowd was DA Clara Voss, her usual poise shaken, a thick folder in hand. "Before you launch an assault on my office," she raised her voice, "know that I will not allow this system to be torn down by an emotional revision built on old documents and manipulative media." General Ellison stepped down from the podium, walked calmly toward her, and stopped just a half step away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was that of a battlefield command, a voice every soldier recognizes before mission begins. Some verdicts are delivered by a court, and some will be handed down by history. You should choose which side you'll be on before it judges you. The room fell completely silent. Clara Voss stiffened, then took a step back. The cameras caught that moment, a rare instance where political power faced true honor and recoiled. That night, back in Cell D at Clearhaven, Jeremiah was correcting a prisoner's grammar essay when a guard entered, handing him a sealed envelope. On the front, it read, "From the Office of Military Affairs, Pentagon, confidential." Jeremiah opened it. Inside was a copy of a Medal of Honor recommendation, signed, as of that day, by General Ellison, Major Trask, and 3 members of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note. "You saved my life in the jungle. Now I return the favor. In a battlefield of lies, Conrad Ellison, Jeremiah placed his hand gently over his heart. He said nothing, but the tears came, not from weakness, but because for the first time in nearly 2 years of hell, he knew he was no longer fighting alone. 3 days after the explosive press conference, the Elmswood County Courthouse held an emergency hearing, so rare that people began lining the sidewalks before dawn. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in full uniform like an unofficial honor guard. Each man and woman wore a small black ribbon pinned to their left shoulder, a symbol of the dignity they had once been forced to swallow. Inside the courtroom, Jeremiah D. Knox sat at the defense table, still clad in his orange prison uniform, but there was no trace of defeat in his posture. Beside him sat attorney Troy Keenan, and across the aisle, General Conrad Ellison stood poised to present the most critical testimony of the trial. The truth. Your Honor, Ellison began, his hand resting firmly on a 3-inch thick binder. I submit into evidence these declassified documents from the Pentagon, records long buried by a system that chose to ignore them because of the color of a soldier's skin. He held up a 1973 internal military telegram, scrawled with a note that turned the courtroom ice cold. Medal of Honor recommendation for Corporal Jeremiah D. Knox. Deferred. Internal political climate race-related. The gallery stirred in shock. In the back row, Luther Grady, a retired military historian, whispered with trembling conviction. We knew. We just didn't have the courage to say it. Next, Jessa Vaughn was called to the stand. She laid out the full scandal, detailing sealed records, political protection, and misconduct involving Chase Whitmore, Hunter Blake, and Logan Fairchild, the 3 young men who once sat smugly before the jury, reciting a story written for them. Attorney Keenan turned to the prosecution bench. We request the court to recall the prosecution's 3 key witnesses, this time under oath and with FBI oversight. The prosecution objected, but under the heat of national media, civil rights pressure, and rising public scrutiny, Judge Beckwith ruled. Motion granted. The witnesses will return, and they will answer to the American people. One by one, Chase Hunter and Logan took the stand. Gone was their arrogance. Under Keenan's cross-examination, their words stumbled, cracked. And then it happened. Logan's voice broke, his face pale, eyes glassy. We made it up. Back then, we thought nobody would believe an old black man. We were wrong. The room was drained of sound, like the air had been vacuumed out. Jessa froze mid-pen stroke. Ellison closed his eyes. Jeremiah didn't flinch or turn. He simply stared ahead, silent, like a man who had waited his entire life for this single moment to arrive. Judge Beckwith looked at Jeremiah. His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like history's final gavel. This court finds Jeremiah D. Knox not guilty on all charges. All accusations are hereby dismissed. Immediate release ordered. That afternoon, as Jeremiah walked out the main gate of Clearhaven Correctional Facility, the golden sun lit his shoulders like a crown. Before him stood a crowd of over 3,000 veterans, civilians, reporters, students, and even those who had once turned away. A retired soldier from Colorado held a sign. Knox kept his oath when the nation forgot theirs. And a teenage boy wore a t-shirt printed with Jeremiah's face and the words. He didn't shout to be heard. He made the whole system go silent. Alyssa and her nephew Jaden stood closest to the gate. As soon as he saw his grandfather, Jaden ran forward, throwing his arms around him and refusing to let go. Jeremiah held the boy tight, his weather hands wrapped protectively around the child's small frame. The man who once sat handcuffed in a roadside diner was now standing at the center of a roaring crowd, not as an exonerated suspect, but as a man who had reclaimed the honor of an entire forgotten generation. That night, national television aired a short clip of Jeremiah walking out of Clearhaven Correctional. He was greeted not like a freed prisoner, but like a returning hero. And the cheering at the bottom of the screen didn't read "Breaking News." It read, "Some people don't have to shout. They make history by standing still." 3 weeks later, Jeremiah D. Knox stood before a special civil rights hearing at the federal courthouse in Elmswood, not as a defendant, but as a victim of a systemic failure, a wrongful conviction fueled by racial bias, political ambition, and calculated indifference. The hearing was broadcast live across Georgia, and for once, the nation watched not the rise of power, but its public unraveling. District Attorney Clara Voss, who once leveraged Jeremiah's case to boost her mayoral campaign, was removed from office on the spot after the State Ethics Commission revealed a cache of internal emails, directives to manipulate the media narrative and suppress alibi evidence. In one leaked audio clip, she said, "We can't let some old black man derail this campaign." When that sentence replayed on the evening news, it became the nail in the coffin of her political career. The two arresting officers, Cole Rickman and Brooke Hensley, were federally indicted for severe constitutional violations, including unlawful arrest, falsifying reports, and racial discrimination. The court delivered its judgment: 6 years in prison for Rickman, 5 years for Hensley, no parole. As Rickman was being escorted to the transport van, a reporter asked, "Anything you want to say to Jeremiah Knox?" The officer said nothing. His head dropped, gazed to the ground, the silence of a man stripped of the power to bury the truth. As for Chase Whitmore, Hunter Blake, and Logan Fairchild, the 3 young men who fabricated the story, each was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for perjury and obstruction of justice. Their families pleaded for leniency, but the judge upheld the sentence. During sentencing, Judge Beckwith looked each of them in the eye and declared, "Your lies didn't just steal a man's freedom. They robbed a community of the truth it was fighting to preserve." And as for Jeremiah, after the hearing, the state of Georgia and the federal government approved a $15 million compensation package, the largest ever awarded in a civil rights case not involving a fatality. But Jeremiah didn't keep the money for himself. Standing before the Elmswood Veterans Memorial, his gaze fixed on the names etched in black granite, he said, "I don't need much to live, but we need a lot more to fix what's been broken." Weeks later, he officially launched the Jeremiah Rigg Foundation, a nonprofit committed to supporting wrongfully convicted veterans, especially those who are black, poor, or forgotten by the justice system. The foundation's logo showed a raised arm, not to strike back, but to lift others up, with the motto, "Justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins when we use our freedom to restore for others." From a breakfast table interrupted by prejudice, Jeremiah D. Knox had turned wrongful imprisonment into a wave that swept away badges, suits, and scripted lies. But what made him a symbol wasn't revenge. It was the way he turned pain into light, not to burn, but to guide. The following spring, Jeremiah walked into the East Room of the White House, where crystal chandeliers shimmered onto navy blue uniform he hadn't worn in nearly 40 years. His medals had been carefully polished, but the space once left blank, where honor had been denied, was now filled. The President of the United States smiled as he pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest, a recognition Jeremiah should have received back in 1973. The room erupted in applause, thunderous and united, but Jeremiah didn't cry. His eyes were steady, like the battlefield stare of a soldier who had seen more than he ever told. And when he spoke, his voice didn't shake. "I didn't come here for a medal. I came to prove that the truth, though delayed, can still win if we hold it with dignity." News networks dubbed him the gatekeeper justice. Front pages ran the headline, "Wrongfully imprisoned war vet becomes national symbol." But Jeremiah wasn't chasing titles. He returned to where it all began, Elmswood High School, the place where he once taught history before his arrest. The old classroom, its chalkboard cracked, desk scratched, was now packed with students, not because the subject was easy, but because the man before them carried a story larger than any textbook could hold. The story of a black veteran, wrongfully imprisoned, who never yelled to be heard, but forced the entire system to bow in silence. Just 6 months later, Congress passed the Veterans Justice Act, a federal law requiring courts to consider military service and PTSD in all criminal cases involving veterans. A photo of Jeremiah standing on Capitol Hill flanked by bipartisan leaders became a portrait of reconciliation, a moral compass in a time when honor seemed like a forgotten relic. One quiet Sunday, during a small school ceremony in Elmswood, a 13-year-old student asked him, "Mr. Knox, if we stay silent, how can we ever change anything?" Jeremiah smiled gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to shout to change the world. You just have to stand firm, with truth in your heart." And if the world stays silent long enough, your silence will echo like a declaration. The story of Jeremiah D. Knox didn't end in victory. It began again, every day, in classrooms, in new laws, and in the hearts of people who once believed they were too small to stand against injustice. Because justice doesn't age, and dignity never retires.